Okay, everyone, welcome to this month's meeting of the Nashville Microsoft Azure Users Group. As you know, we normally meet over at Microsoft, but because of the pandemic, we've been turning our meetings into virtual meetings. And we probably will continue to stream and record the meetings even after this is all over, because we think we can reach a lot more people this way. This is our logo and our website. The YouTube channel is new. That's new with this month, actually last month, but we have it now. And just a reminder that this session is being recorded. I'm obligated to tell you that. Let's go. So a little bit about the group. This is our mission. We're all about Microsoft Azure. We're all about helping each other advance our careers and advance our jobs, and working with Microsoft Azure. All aspects of Azure. We vary our presentations from deep dives to high-level presentations. We try to mix it up a fair amount. Group logistics, as I said a minute ago, normally we do meet at Microsoft and do networking and food, and then have a meeting presentation, a main topic. But we're here online for the duration, I guess. We have over 1,500 registered members, which still amazes me here in Nashville, that there are that many people that are interested in Microsoft Azure. Please tell your friends and coworkers about us. We could always use more members, right? The more members we have, the more potential speakers we have, the more people that are willing to suggest topics that we have. So we'd like to get more members. And on that score, tell us what topics you're interested in. If you have a specific topic that we haven't covered, and you can see the past topics on the Meetup group site, just let us know what you're interested in, and we'll set something up. Excuse me. The board of directors. I'm the founder and president of the group. I founded this group back in 2013 when there were only 4 members, so we've come a long way since then. Roger Dahlman is co-founder and vice president of the group. His day job is that he's an enterprise architect with Deloitte up here in Nashville. And Tim Warner is a member of our board. Tim, you probably, if you know anything about Azure, you probably are familiar with Tim because he does a lot of the Pluralsight courses that are offered, that are available online. So he's a board member. He's also a Microsoft MVP. He's a Pluralsight author. I recently published a book on Azure. Akila Elred, who's on the call. Akila is our director of academic outreach. Akila works with, hang on, got to invite some people. Excuse me. Akila is our director of academic outreach. Like I say, she works with the universities and colleges in the area, recruiting new members for the group and making them aware of our existence. And Matthew Puckett, he's our Microsoft sponsor. He's the one that's arranged for us to have all the meeting space at Microsoft that we've been having for the last six years plus. So Matthew is a friend to the group. And Jack Hagler is our permanent refreshment sponsor. Jack is from Vaco, and they've been with us also for the same amount of time. Oops. Hang on. Get some more people in. And along the, since we mentioned sponsors, we want to do a shout out to our sponsors, to Microsoft, who's provided meeting space for the last six plus years, for Vaco, who's been our refreshment sponsor for pretty much the same time, and also this time for our board member, Tim Warner, who has provided us with this team subscription so that we could stream and record the meeting. You can find Tim, his on Twitter and on the web as Tech Trainer Tim. Okay. And again, we are starting up, even though we have a permanent meeting space sponsor and we have a permanent refreshment sponsor, we're interested in new sponsors for doing, call it a small sponsorship, where we'll give you a couple of minutes to talk about your group or product in exchange for a raffle prize or something else that we can raffle off to the membership. Okay, we've got a meeting coming up next month, and I can introduce the presenter. And I know the presenter very well because the presenter is myself. Every year or so, I do an entry-level presentation for the group on Azure. It's titled New to Azure, or Azure What to Use When. Sometimes I vary the subjects, but that's coming. That'll be on May 21st. And again, repeating, if you have a topic you're interested in, let us know. So tonight's meeting is really going to be an important one because with the pandemic, a lot of people are working from home, much more so than ever did before. And Windows Virtual Desktop is something that really plays to that need. Okay, and with that, I'm going to introduce our presenter tonight. It's Jerry Lambden, who's a senior consultant at Planet Technologies. And Jerry, I'm going to stop sharing so you can share, okay?
Sounds good.
Okay.
How's everybody doing? It's very interesting to see Matt Puckett's name as your Microsoft sponsor. I worked with Puckett for several years at HCA when I still worked in the area, so that's a blast from my past. But so as Bill was saying, Windows Virtual Desktop is gaining a lot of popularity. It was released into general availability sometime last fall, I think around maybe October. It's something we've been clamoring for from Microsoft for a long time, right? So they've always had traditional RDS services that were available. They never quite stacked up against Citrix and Horizon and some of the other products. And also, we were also claiming for something was Azure based, right? What I want to deploy, while I was doing structure on-prem, if I already had a heavy investment in Azure. So when Virtual Desktop came along and kind of filled that gap. So we're going to walk through it today. If you guys have any questions while I'm talking, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if I see them, I will answer them. Bill, if I don't see them, please yell at me to make sure we do answer them. So again, as Bill was saying, a lot of people are getting interested in this now because of our new reality, people working from home. A lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations who maybe have Azure, don't have a big investment in work from home technologies. And it's an easy jump for them from what they're doing now into Windows Virtual Desktop. It's really easy to set up. It's fairly easy to manage. Right now, there's a lot that you have to do with PowerShell still. Not a lot you can do with the GUI right now. I think you're going to see some improvements to that next month. There's going to be released as a scuttlebutt. So we'll jump right into it. I always advise keeping the Windows Virtual Desktop documentation tab open when you're doing this because there's some PowerShell command in here and also some links to register the application. They're just handy. So one of your first things you want to do when you're setting up Windows Virtual Desktop is register both the client and the app with Azure AD, which I've already done here in my tenants. So if we pop over to Enterprise Applications and we take a look for Windows Virtual Desktop, you'll see them there at the bottom. There they are, these guys right here. You have to go through those steps first before they'll show up here. But once you have that set up, you do have to create a service principal to deploy your host pools later on in the process. It is the same kind of process that you've probably used a million times to create service principals for other Azure applications. You won't go too deep into that. Just don't do what I do, which is routinely forget to record these values once they get past these variables, because then you end up recreating your service principal and you feel silly. So something important, you need to do assign the RDS owner role, which allows the service principal to interact with the Azure Fabric. So they're an important step to miss, or not to miss. And once you go through all that, you're actually ready now to provision a host pool with Windows Virtual Desktop. And we'll walk through that and talk about some of the gotchas, some of the decision points that you can make when you're doing this, and some things that just to be aware of. So if you create a new resource and you say Windows Virtual Desktop, you're presented with an option to provision a host pool, which apparently I have my subscription disabled, so we'll do this somewhere else. We'll do it over here instead. So step one is to make sure you don't, disable a subscription in your personal tenant and forget about it before you do a demo. But if you launch it up here, same principle. You select your principal and resource group. Best practice is to pick a resource group that's going to house all of your virtual machines for Windows Virtual Desktop and any other Azure resources that are going to be applicable for that to keep it all together. It's easy to manage, and also Bill will tell you, I'm sure, a lot about Azure governance. You're doing your hostful names and things of that nature. We always recommend that you have a naming convention to kind of keep things separate and easy to manage. I'm going to just name it that. One thing we have found, and you guys already know this, that resources are actually cheaper in East US 2 rather than East US. So being in Nashville, that will be part of the country. You guys will probably pick that region. 2 is a little bit cheaper. And then here's the big advantage of Windows Virtual Desktop versus the old RDS is there's actually a new version of Windows 10 called Windows 10 Multi-Session. So this is the difference between pooled and personal. If we choose pooled here, which would be what I would recommend to you guys whenever possible, you'll get, Windows 10 session host running multi-session where multiple people can connect to that VM. In the past, you're looking at deploying Windows Server for that and then presenting it with a Windows 10 or Windows 7 in the past desktop experience, right? This time we're actually deploying Windows 10. And if you do need to deploy Windows 7, you can. It is supported. It does not support the pool sessions. You can only do personal sessions. And there's a lot more work that goes into it in the background to make it work. But it is supported if you have any old legacy applications that are still Windows 7 dependent. And right now, you can specify users here. One of the weird quirks and gotchas about Windows Virtual Desktop right now is if you have an Azure AD group, whether you created it in Azure AD or you let it synchronize up from your on-prem AD, that it doesn't actually support adding those users to the app groups, which we'll cover later on, that actually control access to the different resources you make available. You have to add them by UPN. So that's, again, one of those things that we expect to change maybe as early as next month. What I normally recommend to people is go ahead and set your groups up the way you manage any other application. Put your people in there. Use some PowerShell just to pull people out of those AD groups, add them to the app groups. I'll show you guys an example of that. Don't try to specify something here; it'll get messy, hard to manage. But once you get all your fields filled out there, you do want to create an availability set because it will scale. It will sit behind a load balancer. Now, you can use the Microsoft math here, which is if you go to the Azure calculator and pull up Windows Virtual Desktop, it will give you a similar number. What I really recommend here is knowing your applications, right? If you have a lot of web-based applications and all you're really presenting to users is a desktop that can authenticate to your on-prem environment, then you would go with light and you might even go with custom. And you can get, if you say, hey, I only have maybe 100 users, I maybe only need 10 virtual machines based on, I usually recommend the D2SV3 VMs. Maybe I only need 10 of those VMs, right? And there is a scaling solution behind it that we'll get into later on, but it's just one of those opportunities to not deploy more VMs than you need because we can scale them up and down. There are cost savings opportunities later on, but just you got to think about every VM you deploy is some amount of Azure spend. So it's really important to know your applications and know the amount of resources that you need based on the number of users that you have to be able to deploy them. And another thing, we'll actually just do one VM right now. We'll go ahead and do one, and we're just going to deploy a B series VM. It's important to remember the B series are not production ready VMs, they're burstable. So you do want to do at least a D series for your production workload, but when you're just doing a demo, we can definitely do a B series. So for your virtual machine naming prefix, this is how it's going. If I had selected, say, 2 VMs, it tells you the information bubble. This is how it's going to name them. So if I say WVD demo, then the name of my VMs are going to be demo 1 and 2, but it is going to add a hyphen right here. So if you add a hyphen here, which is intuitive to do so, it'll double hyphen the names, which is not a big deal. But if you're like me and you have OCD, that will really bother you. But you can put whatever naming convention you have for your on-prem VMs or your physical workstations, or if you've created a new standard just for these VMs, you can specify it here. It's pretty straightforward. And then here, the real big thing about Windows Virtual Desktop that I can't stress enough is to use a gallery image whenever you can. If you have a lot of applications that you want to make available In Windows Virtual Desktop for your users, you can select Manage Image. You can even do blob storage and upload your image there. We don't recommend it. I recommend deploying a Windows 10 multi-session VM into Azure, and then giving a public IP or using Bastion, logging into it, installing your applications, using sysprep, and going back to the old sysprep days when you used to have to do that to deploy, your OSD strategies for on-prem physical devices. A lot of you guys maybe do that today, but it's not quite as clumsy as it used to be. But they're bringing a little bit of that back from an image standpoint. But if you don't have to do that, don't do it. In the gallery, there is 2 versions of Windows 10 multi-session. There's Office 365, and there's just without Office 365. They have some older versions available. I think it goes back all the way to 1803 if your organization is not yet upgraded or standardized on the newest version of Windows 10. So they offer you some leeway there. But whatever possible, just go with the gallery image because it's going to be less management for you in the long run. And also there are some, the reason people will do manage images was to make those applications available. I talked about a second ago. There is an exciting feature that's coming that will kind of mitigate that. It's called MSIX App Attach. If you're not familiar with MSIX, it's kind of a modern take on using the old Wise packager or maybe even Orca, and it's built on top, or it's kind of the evolution of AppV as well. So you take your application, you package it up, and you can use it today. You can deploy it through SCCM or Intune. You can deploy your applications out, and it's more of a containerized approach. You're not actually installing your approach. It's using a player that's part of Windows 10 to actually mount it. And with MSIX App Attach, which it's available for Windows Virtual Desktop, what it basically does is mounts a VHD that has the application in it available for your users, right? So at that point, the days of having to manage your images will pretty much be over, right? So if you can start pivoting to that now for your normal day-to-day application packaging, it'll really help you out once this becomes a public feature and not something that's just in private preview. So you can do whatever kind of disk type that you need. We're going to select Windows 10 multi-session without Office for now. We're just going to do a standard SSD to save a little bit of money. So these VMs that are part of Virtual Desktop, they have to be joined to a domain. They can be joined to Azure Active Directory domain services. There we go. Or they can be managed to your on-prem domain. Most customers are going to want it joined to their on-prem domain because they have group policy in place they want to apply, and you can apply that to these VMs the same way you would a physical machine. So your network drives for your users might be a group policy you want to be able to map or things of that nature, but it has to be joined to one of the two. And then it goes without saying, if you do want to join to your on-prem domain, you do need either a VPN tunnel or express route set up between Azure and your data center where your resources reside. That's something most people are already going to have in place, but if not, it is going to be a requirement if you want to join these devices to your on-prem domain. We recommend, just from a cost standpoint and performance standpoint, that you deploy a couple of domain controllers into Azure as well, into the same virtual network where you're deploying Virtual Desktop, and also create a site just for those devices, just from a performance standpoint. So it's not reaching down across either your VPN tunnel or express route every single time it needs to authenticate. Just, you don't have to do that, right? But it is something we recommend from a performance standpoint. And I'm going to go ahead and, I don't know if this account actually has rights to join a domain, so we're going to find out how that goes. But you will, well, if I can remember my password. So you will need to specify a UPN here, right? So if you have a domain account that you use for joining systems to the domain when you're doing something like SCCM OSD, you can use that same account. Let's make sure you're using the UPN for it. This account needs to be not subject to MFA, right? So if you have an MFA policy set up using conditional access, make sure this account is exempted from that. If it does have MFA applied, it will fail. It will not work. And then also, it is, in theory, smart enough to figure out what your domain is based on your VPN. In practice, that's not so much. It often does not work. So I definitely recommend you put in the domain that you want to join. And also, if you have specific OU paths that you want for, maybe just specific agency that you support underneath your top level organization, or you have a different OU just for these Windows Virtual Desktops, if you have that requirement, you can drop them in here. And I'm going to bounce over to our Azure Active Directory domain services instance and grab what we have set up as the domain. Maybe I am. Here we go. And when you're selecting your virtual network, it's very important to make sure that you're selecting your virtual network. Apparently, we don't have any available, so we're going to create a new one here. That's interesting. It's important to make sure you're selecting the virtual network that has access to your express router, your VPN tunnel, right? So you don't expect to put them in the same virtual network, but if you put them in a different virtual network, make sure that there's peering in place so they can do that communication. And it's just, there's also a cost involved with peering. So it's depending on what your standard practices already are for how you're managing virtual networks in Azure. Just make sure that you're taking that into account when you're deploying this on your desktop and making the decision about, how you're going to configure your virtual networks in order to support it. We have a bunch of virtual networks in our lab, but I don't apparently have access to them. So this is very much a place where we play around, so things work, 80% of the way, and as Bill will attest. So. That's important to remember. This group here, that's fine. You can leave that the way it is. For your Windows Virtual Desktop tenant name, this is whatever you've named your tenant when you created your original tenants, which actually we will do here real quick with PowerShell. Right, so when we get to this point here, we talked through how we need to register the application, and then it talks about this. We actually need to create the Windows Virtual Desktop tenant, and they do use the word tenant, which is a bit confusing. It is separate from your Azure tenant. I waited to this point now so we can easily grab the name and drop it in here, but this is a step you would want to take before you got to this point. So earlier today, we ripped all the tenants out of our demo lab, the idea that we were going to redeploy them. So the very first thing that you need to do is load the module, which I'm going to steal from a script that we've been writing here to deploy this in a more automated fashion, which it just pulls out from the gallery. And whilst working on that, this will allow you to authenticate to RDS, or excuse me, which is Virtual Desktop. As you can tell, they still have the RDS acronym in the PowerShell templates. And when you do that, it will ask you to authenticate. And of course, we have MFA turned on, which means the account, I use the same account to join the domain. Oh, we didn't like that. I used that account to join the domain in my previous step, which means is going to fail because it does need to be exempted from MFA. We're going to try a different account here. Well, the most difficult task of any implementation is typing your password correctly. There we go. I like that much better. And actually, before I forget, I'm going to back up and change this so it doesn't fail on it. Which is a different password. No, well, see. It's also why LastPass is a great tool. All right. So we're going to back up here, and then here's where we actually go through and create our name. So we've already authenticated in, and when you do this, you're going to need you can give it whatever name you want, whatever name works with your standard. It does support spaces. You will need your Azure ID, tenant ID, and your subscription ID for the tenant you're going to, the subscription you're going to deploy it into. So we're just going to copy this. and drop it in here. And we're going to name it Windows Virtual Desktop Demo. This is a friendly name. So when users log into either the web portal, if they use the client, this is a name they will see. So let's put some thought into that when you're picking it and setting it up here. And then we're going to go grab our Azure Active Directory, tenant ID, and drop that in. And then go grab our subscription. Oh, rejected. Which is because, well, it's likely because we missed a very important step, which is a very important lesson learned when you're deploying this, so you don't run into the same problem that I just did. So there's a couple of roles for Windows Virtual Desktop that you want to assign if you're deploying it. And let's see. This is the wrong account. So you want to have this tenant creator account assigned, and it's assigned to one of my users, but not both of my users. So we touched on that briefly, but we didn't go into it in depth. And that is a good example of why we should have went into it a little more in depth. You just got to remember, because without this tenant creator role, what we tried to do is going to fail in much the same fashion that we just did, right? And also this account needs to be a global administrator as well. So those are going to be your two dependencies. So now with that role assigned, we try again. We'll give it a second. If it doesn't work, we may bounce back over to my tenant and do this. Let's see here. Yeah, let's try this again. One more time. Nope, it doesn't like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this name just so we can go on. I can show you guys how it works. Things are a bit amiss in our demo tenant. So you grab the name you specified here when you created your pool. And then right here, you drop that name in. Then earlier, right, we also created a service principal name. And the service principal here would be what we'd use for this. So we'll go ahead and create a new one just to walk through it. So, and it does require that we have the Azure AD module installed, which is not included with the previous module. I already had it loaded there, so it's good. So we wanted to be able to connect, and when it connects, it's going to pass connection information to that variable. So the way they have it laid out here in this example is the easiest way to make sure the information is passed to those variables and available for you to both notate and also just pull out for the GUI here where we're deploying our host pool. All right, so we can just copy this in. And one thing that you'll notice that if you do this a lot, you know, if you had different people coming here and doing this, maybe they're not sure what the original sort of service principle are, you can end up with a lot of these service principles. Come on. Well, I can't remember the right principal or my command line on top of my head, but you can look and see, and they will create several of these with the same name, but the object ID will be different. So just, you ideally don't want to do that as a best practice. You want to make sure that you are creating one service principal, documenting what those credentials are, and that way you have it moving forward. You can grab your password and drop it in. And it will also, actually we're going to do this one, which is the application ID for the principal. Drop that in here, and then also it passes your Azure AD tenant ID to a variable as well. So you don't have to go hunting for that again. It's just available for you. Get extra row characters. There we go. And this might fail validation because of the permission problems we had. Yeah, so it will give you where it has failed, right? It doesn't like near existing VNet, so we won't create the VNet for us. So let's go look at that here real fast. And create a subnet. That should all be good. Still doesn't like it. But what it will do, so it's important, this is a good illustration also of why I always have your networking in place, right? When you're coming here and you're trying to set this up on this screen right here, you don't want to be creating a new virtual network and you set that here. It will try, as it illustrates for you. I think actually my problem is I don't have the right tools or the right permissions to be able to do so with my account. But you want to ideally already have this in place, right? It goes back to what I was talking to earlier about making sure that you can authenticate to your on-prem Active Directory and all that kind of fun stuff. That's a strategy to have it well thought out before you come in here and create your virtual network. So in theory, this will already exist for you before you get to this point. So I will pop back over to, let's see here. Yeah, so we're going to pop in this resource group here. So what's it going to do? It's going to create these VMs. It's going to create a storage count. It's going to create an availability set. It's going to basically create everything you see here, right? You can assign public IP addresses to these devices. It is important to remember that it's not best practice. You do not want to have a public IP address in all your VMs because it poses a fairly large security risk because you're exposing them to the internet, because you also probably have the RDP port 3389 open. So make sure you're removing those if you need to do any kind of management of them, or you can use Bastion instead. Microsoft will recommend setting up a public IP if you need to log into these systems and do management, and if you build a VM that you can use to actually sysprep and then use that as your managed image rather than using a gallery image, you're probably going to end up applying a public IP to that system. That VM is going to become pretty much useless after you do a capture on it. You have to delete it. But if you don't do that capture, maybe do it more than once, just be mindful of that. Just reduce your attack surface. But this is the infrastructure that it kind of deploys, and you'll see if we had done more than one VM, in this instance I only did a single VM, because I may have had two at one point. No, I only did one. So this would be the only VM that would be available in my session or my host pool to be able to show you kind of how this works. So if we look at this and we launch the Windows Virtual Desktop app, this is, let me unsubscribe from this so you get the full experience. So when you first open it up, this is the way it looks like, and you hit subscribe. It'll ask you to log in. And we're going to do my personal Well, tenants. Let's see how far it'll let me go with the subscription and the state that it's in. This is very important. Don't let this happen because you normally do not, right? Because a lot of users are going to be doing this from their personal devices. So this is when you're educating your users about how to access this. There is a web portal you can go through as well. The experience of the client's much better. Make sure they don't accidentally allow management of their personal devices. And I also would set up some rules in the back end to prevent that. So you see here, I have published 2 instances of WordPad to myself that are available to be launched. And this is kind of the experience you look. If you had a full desktop experience available, it would be listed here as kind of a host pool. It would just say the name of the host pool on it. You can give that a friendly name. So you can say, you know, whatever you wanted to name it. You know, in my case, I have my initial setup as my organization name, so maybe that would, you know, be Jelly Desktop or something of that nature. It's just really up to you. You can set a friendly name on it, but that's where you can get. Now, if you get into management, and then I will actually connect to this so we can look at that a little bit. Grab the right command here. The management of it, that's when you really get into doing a lot of PowerShell. So if and there's the PowerShell command reference is available on TechNet, and it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty robust documentation, so it's fairly easy to consume. But, you know, you start at the top and you look at your tenant, right? So this is a tenant that I have set up here, and it has the tenant name, which is a very important piece. And I can say, you know, I have only one host pool set up. Usually the way you'll end up doing host pools is per use case that you might have for yourself or your customers. For example, I want to prevent a full desktop experience for the folks in HR. You know, all their applications, they'd be web-based, they may be using like SAP. So you stop and you think about how many VMs am I going to need for how many users, and then, you know, what kind of resources I'm going to need for those number of users based on just the number of resources they consume with the applications on their physical desktops on a daily basis. You know, you use that, you do your math, you figure out how many VMs you need and how many, and which VM series, right? How many vCPUs, things of that nature. And that would be, you know, your one host pool. And if you look at your host pool, you get information here, and here is where you can set your friendly name. See, I haven't set it on this one, so it has just the normal name here. And it has the load balancer type you can specify for each. You can do breadth or depth. We recommend that you use breadth just for the obvious reasons, right? It's a lot easier to spin up new resources than it is to add resources to existing VMs. Also, you can set up service validation, which just has set up here. If I wanted to actually see the session hosts or the VMs inside this host pool, to say session host and specify this, and then also the host pool name, which I have named with a name I have no idea if it makes any sense to me now, but it made perfect sense to me at the time, I'm sure. But we can see the session host in here. And if you're troubleshooting this, it's very important to come look at status, right? Mine's unavailable because my subscription's in a weird state right now, right? So you want to say available here. Some of the things you might see is no heartbeat. Depending on issues you might have with the agent, there is an agent that gets installed on all these VMs, the Windows Virtual Desktop agent, and also the Windows Virtual Desktop bootloader. And if they're having issues, you might get an error here like no side-by-side listener available, things of that nature. So if you're having users having problems connecting and they're getting resource errors, this is a good place to start, right? You can come and see what the status of these VMs are. Now, when you create a full desktop experience, there is a default app group, which is what controls actually access to the different virtuals in the host pool, called desktop application group. We'll get it right here. We can look at all of them. And they will be, each app group is assigned to a host pool. So it's the kind of hierarchy is tenant, host pool, and then under that you have your session hosts and your app groups and things of that nature. So here's the app group that's available in here. Oh, well, provided that I could type. So there's two here, right? So there is the default one, the desktop application group. This is going to be your full desktop user group that it's created by default, right? So as we mentioned earlier, if you have your users in an Active Directory group, you can use some PowerShell commands that look very similar to this somewhere right here, right? So basically we're just connecting to Azure AD. We're getting the members of that group by their object ID and then just doing a for each loop and adding all of those into this app group, right? So it's a little bit kludgy right now. There are some third-party tools, like Nerdio is a good example. They give you a GUI to do that, but in the back end, they're doing the same thing. And hopefully app groups will support just adding Azure Directory groups in there instead of having doing individual users by UPN. But you can see the groups here. Is in here, I have set up an app group is specific just to these applications that you see, right? So when you create this app group, you can say these are the people who are going to be in it, and then also these are the applications that are installed on the virtual machines in the host group, in the host pool, that I want these app group users to have access to, right? So clearly I've just been messing around with that and selected WordPad, to which this is WordPad are available. And if I launch this, which I'm not sure it's going to work because just of where it is, maybe it will. Yeah, it wouldn't work because, yeah, this is actually a UPN mismatch error. But what it'll actually do is log a user into the VM where this is hosted, right? So if you came and you look at our get session host up here, you would see that it was available. You would see that it may, if it's a persistent instead of a pooled, it would have an assigned user, which is something to keep in mind. If you have 25 users and you have 25 VMs in your host pool, you add a 26th user. If they are persistent instead of pooled, it does assign a user to an individual VM to make sure that that user gets that VM every time. So something else just to keep in mind that will happen. But you can also see your user hosts. Let's see here. That's right here, I do believe. Yeah, here you also see your different, actually there is a way to, and then you can see the irritation of why people want a GUI behind this. So you just here to remember what all of your commandlets are, right? So you can do a user session. That is the name of that commandlet to see who is logged on. So if we say host full name, that's all the information it requires. Yeah, see, so I don't have anything open right now, so we didn't get any return. If I had this open, it would see that I was logged in. It would say what VM I was using to consume this resource, even though it's just an application. And also you can remove user sessions, I'm pretty sure, with this command here. No. There is a command that you can use to actually keep people off. I have to look up the command reference and see what it is. So if you have a user who's been inactive for a very long time and you don't have anything in place to remove it from a scaling standpoint, which we'll get to in a minute, you can go through and remove users manually. So again, you have to use PowerShell, and it is a bit kludgy to get it done, but you can't do things of that nature. You can actually deploy all this as well, right? So if you wanted to do a new host pool and you wanted to do it here through PowerShell rather than using the GUI, you could do that, right? So I give it the tenant name. You want to actually execute this. And then give it a host pool name. And you can do it here, right? Once you've done this, you could create virtual machines that are just do the normal GUI that you would use to normally deploy a virtual machine. You can just pick the right OS here. And if you were creating a template for a managed image, it would be much the same way. It is important when you're going and looking at, when you're looking at it here, if you search for Windows 10 Enterprise, the search is not real good. It's actually not going to give you anything in a reasonable manner anyway, right? It still is Pro first. If you do have persistent VMs, it's important to note that Pro is not supported. you must deploy enterprise, right? So if you scroll down, you can find multi-session, right? So here's 1909, 1903, and 1809. It's like the last version, which makes sense because that's the last branch version of Windows 10 support off the top of my head. But you can select these here. You can deploy these VMs normally. And you would do this if you were trying to do a scripted approach, right? If you need to deploy, hundreds of thousands of VMs at a time, and you wanted to do it in parallel, you could do it this way, and then deploy the Windows Desktop agent to them after the fact. And the way you would join them to the host pool is by generating a token that is required with some PowerShell commands right here. Right, this will basically export the registration info to a token for that host pool. And then when you install the client on them, you would need to specify that information. So it's important when you do this to understand these tokens are not available forever, right? So if you were doing this through a tool like SCCM and you're specifying in your commands that, hey, this is the token you're going to need to join the host pool, that's not going to be something you can manage long term because those tokens will expire. And you have to update your SCCM command to be able to do that. So a lot of people do go this route. There are some scripts that some folks at Microsoft have released to the Azure Galley that will deploy a lot of these VMs at a time. Those are usually only helpful if you want to do persistent, if you need to deploy, hundreds of or thousands of persistent VMs at a time and then also destroy them. Some people like to go that route. They'll spin them up at the beginning of the week or the beginning of the day and destroy them at the end, right? It's much easier just, of course, to power those down. But it is something that some organizations do, and there are some automation tools out there for you already that can do that from a simple manner. So we didn't get to actually deploy anything, but all we really missed was just a screen where we were watching paint dry. So it got us to the same, point we already saw. So we didn't miss a whole lot. The other two really cool things about Windows Virtual Desktop, one is FS Logics. FS Logics, if you guys are not familiar, is a organization that Microsoft bought recently. Don't quite remember where it is, but when it was done. But it has a really cool feature of basically managing your roaming profiles from your old roaming profile days, right? So it supports hosting the user profiles in a couple of different ways. You can set up a file share on a server in Azure, and that's what we recommend. And the reason you recommend that approach is because the other approach, Azure Files, does not support authenticating to a on-prem domain. So if you're using Azure Active Directory Domain Services, Azure Files is easier. You can go down that road, but most people are not going to be in that scenario, right? They're going to be in this scenario here. You spin up a VM, you put up a file share on it, make sure there's enough room in your file share. I'd recommend, even for smaller organizations, starting at a terabyte and scrolling up from there. And then you can just use some group policy, which it has referenced here in the FS Logic documentation, to deploy out to your VMs. That basically enables it, and then it tells the computers where to look for the profiles, wherever your file share happens to be. And it does go through describe how you can use NetApp files if you want to do that. There's a little more cost associated with NetApp files, and then it does briefly touch here on Azure Files if you have Azure ADDS set up, which most organizations probably are not going to have, right? The other thing is scaling a host. Now, this tool is cool. If you're a PowerShell guy like me and you start going through these two PowerShell scripts, which I have saved here somewhere, and I'll show you guys, that somebody at Microsoft wrote, will make you very irritated because they work, right? But just the thought process that was put into it, you can tell was something, we gotta get this out here quickly and get it done. So it's something that I would expect to improve, right? So there's two. There's a script to create your Azure automation account, because the scaling does use Azure automation, which means you have to have an account set up for that. And this script will do it for you in this document here. We'll walk you through that, right? It'll even show you how to download it. This is to create the Logic app, right? So it'll walk you through downloading it and everything you need to do to be able to specify the parameters. And all our parameters you guys specify in the script to create the account, just to name. So we'll create the account for you. You want to dump it into the same resource group where you have all your Windows Virtual Desktop resources. already deployed just for ease of management. And then it will also create the runbook for you at this time when you run this script. So it'll pull that runbook down. And in order to execute that runbook, you want to set up a logic app. And the logic app is the script that will really irritate you because the way they have it set up is to ask you for every single thing that you would like to specify, which not the best. So it's important to read through this doc when you do it the first couple of times. You got to make sure you capture certain things and you create your account, like the webhook URI. That's going to be important. You have to create a run as account. One thing that really can strip you up if you've not used a run as account before is it will give you a display name for that run as account for your Azure automation account. That's not what it's looking for. It's actually looking for just the name, not the display name. If you dip a display name in, it will fail. It asks, your standard questions of your Azure AD tenant inscription ID, things it needs, your tenant name, the host pool. So if you have multiple host pools, you would set up a logic app to execute your runbook per host pool, right? And the reason for that is you may have different criteria. But the real things you can really specify in here is you can specify how often your runbook runs and what your peak time is. So your peak time is used to make sure it's not powering off VMs during peak time. So if your peak time is 6 to 6, it is not going to power off VMs during that time to not make sure it doesn't cause a user impacts or a performance problem. You do need to specify your time difference from UTC to make sure that Azure understands what time it actually is, where your users are located. This variable here, the session threshold per CPU, basically just says how many sessions per vCPU per session host or per virtual machine before I have to look to turn on another VM, right? So it's not going to create a new VM, a net new VM, but it will power on an existing VM that's in the host pool that's maybe been deallocated because, outside of peak times, it's not currently being used. It will specify how many session hosts you can have running at a certain time, or the minimum number, excuse me. So if you're in the middle of the night, right, you're going to have much lower demands. And for that, we recommend just this to 1. So you've always got 1 VM running that's serving your host pool. So, if you're offering a service up to, say, a good example of this is like a local county, right? So maybe your 911 folks need to do something specific in the middle of the night, and they're going to use virtual desktop or the fire department, or if you have, health and human services, things of that nature. If you always have 1 VM running in every host pool, you know that you're always having this available to your users. And you can set it up to log users off after a certain amount of time, right? We usually set this to 10 to 15 minutes after an active session. So if they're, past peak time, and they're not, and they'll do this during peak time. If they're past peak time and they've been inactive for whatever you set this to, it will kick the users off, and then you'll give them a message here, right? You specify the title and the body of that message. But after that, it will turn off those VMs after it disconnects the allo users. Location is just the region that you have deployed in. So either East US 2 or East US, probably for most of us, maybe Central. This is just your account name. Maintenance tags are very important because maintenance tags is how it determines what VM to always leave on when it's powering down VMs. So you make sure you have your assets always available. But that's pretty much what you'll do. Just keep in mind, some people have the expectation that it is going to spin up new VMs during the day if demand is high, right? But it will not do that. So you got to really keep in mind. It goes back to they have guidance to know your applications, right? And know what kind of resources they're going to consume because you want to make sure you have enough resources available during the day. Now, there are, again, third-party tools that have some scaling engines in place that will spit up new VMs for you based on the image that you specify, whether it be a custom image or a gallery image. But those are third-party tools with added costs, right, and added manageabilities. But if it's something you're interested in, you can do that with Azure Automation. If you don't have time and the skill set to be able to develop that solution based on what Microsoft's provided you, you may look at one of those third-party tools. So that's what the automation can and can't do. It's mostly a cost-saving mechanism, right, to make sure your VMs get spun off or shut down at night, to make sure they're not just sitting around and burning hours and burning cycles and costing you Azure spend. And they do have an article here about MSIX app attached that we talked about earlier today. Again, something I would keep on your radar. It's going to be helpful for deploying applications across your organizations, and it's just going to be really easy once this becomes available for Windows Virtual Desktop to be able to manage the VMs inside the solution. There is also something cool. I don't know if it touches on it here, but there is also something cool coming with Teams called AV Redirect, which basically takes, historically, regardless of your VDI solution, whether it be Citrix or RDS or Horizon, soft phones have not worked real well, right? And Teams is subject to that same problem. So basically what they've done with Teams AV Redirect is they've taken all the processing off the VMs, right? It happens locally on your computer where you've connected to your VM, and it happens in Azure. That's something else, much like MSIX App Attach, that is available in, I think it may be in preview, but available, not in private preview. It's in one of the two, right? It's not something that's quite ready for prime time, not something that's in general release yet, but it is something, general availability, but it is something that is coming that will really help resolve that problem, which has been one of the major roadblockers to people adopting VDI in the past at a large scale. That and cost is usually the two big drivers for that. And one other point here I'll make real fast before we start asking questions or QA is actually two things before we get to Q&A, is you do need licenses for this. Now, if you go and you look, you don't need additional licenses based on what you already have for your users, right? So the only additional spend is just going to be your VM compute time. But your users do need to be licensed for one of these licenses here, right? Which you're probably already going to have if you're an Office 365 shop. If you have a G3 or a G5, it does not list it here, but we have gotten some guidance from Microsoft that, that those will also work. Right now, Windows Virtual Desktop is not available in GCC High, but it is available in GCC. And the reason for that is just the GCC and a Dynamics or a Office 365 tenant in GCC still sits on top of commercial Azure AD, and also your compute space is going to be in commercial Azure, or not commercial compute Azure. So for that reason, GCC works. So if you have GCC licenses assigned in that scenario, you'll be okay. The reason these licenses are required is just to activate the OS. There's a new mechanism called Azure AD authentication that these virtual desktop VMs will use. It's only used here. And without that in place, it'll work for 90 days if you don't have any licenses assigned to your users. And after that, you'll start getting your NAG messages that you would expect to get in the old days when you were just using KMS servers, right? And KMS servers are not supported for this solution. So even if you have your VPN tunnel or your express route tunnel in place and you're trying to activate it with KMS with MAC keys, it's not going to work. It's not a supported solution. So the other thing real fast that I want to touch on is just MFA. They have an article here, but it's, again, it really comes down to, again, making sure you have the licenses in place for it. It's the same way you set up MFA for any other cloud tool from Microsoft. Just set up your conditional access policy that controls it for Windows Virtual Desktop. Again, that account that you're going to use, which is actually good that we still have this open. So this account here that you're going to use to join devices to the domain during your deployment of your host pools, your VMs and your host pools. Just make sure, again, that account is exempted from MFA, because if it's not, it will cause it to fail. So that's a lot of information. I know I talked for a long time. Those are the highlights. I didn't see any messages pop up, but I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention. So does anybody have any questions about managing Windows Virtual Desktop, or maybe use cases, or where they could use it, or just questions at all?
Yeah, anyone who has a question, just unmute yourself.
Wow, not a talkative bunch, Bill.
Hey, this is John. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure, John, go ahead.
Yeah, so in typical environments, especially environments where you want to control user access to sensitive information, in the past, people created jump boxes or a team of virtual servers for developers or anybody else to connect to the environment and to prevent data from being exfiltrated. So would this be a good alternative solution than actually standing up a terminal services farm, a remote desktop services farm? Whereas, you've got multiple people can log into a single VM, and then on top of that, you've got the OS that they're familiar with versus Windows Server.
Yeah, I would say the yes. The answer to your question is yes, for the reasons you just outlined, right? It's going to be a lot easier for you to manage, and they're still going to have all the resources that they need to get where they need to go, right? There would be some network configuration, it sounds like, that we need to make sure was in place, just to make sure they can access whatever kind of resources they were getting to, if they were on a secure network or something of that nature. So, it's something just to keep in mind from an Azure networking standpoint. But broadly, yes, rather than having to spin up a terminal service farm, whether you did it in on-prem in your data center or if you did it in Azure, it's going to be a lot easier to spin up some Windows 10 multi-session VMs and tell your users that, hey, go here instead, go through the GUI, the web interface or through the app, and then you can get anywhere you need to go. And it's just a lot less work for you guys on the back end to manage that solution for them.
And I just had two other quick follow-up questions. One is, does this work with Bastion?
It does work with Bastion. So my background is more with endpoint management, CM, Intune, that kind of fun stuff. And this is a natural kind of segue into that. It does work with Bastion, but I couldn't tell you how to set it up. That would be a question probably for Bill, but it is supported.
Okay, and then the other question was, with Windows Server, for example, I don't believe like Xbox Live and some of those other features that come with Windows 10 is installed by default. Are some of those desktop items that you wouldn't want in your server environment installed? And if so, what are some ways that you can automate removing those items?
So with Windows 10 multi-session, they're not installed by default because Microsoft had the forward thinking to kind of remove those. Now, if you have the use case to use a persistent VM and you used an image that you developed on-prem, which my experience with that is that it works okay. That we've run into some issues with some applications, usually security applications, that get banked into those images and getting them to deploy, supposed to deploy those images. If you're not doing it, if you're doing it through group policy or you're doing it through, MDT or SCCM or whatever your OSC solution is, those apps are going to show up, right? When they get the group policy, if you're deploying it that way, you can turn them off that way. There's a PowerShell script that you can use that the community has developed. The only thing about that PowerShell script is that every time there's a new branch version of Windows, you are reliant upon the gentleman at MVP. I forget who it is, but one of the Intune MVPs wrote it, to go in and update it for the new branch version of Windows. Right now, these devices do not support being managed with Intune if you're an Intune shop, but that's a hard stop for your Windows 10 multi-session VMs, for your Windows 10 enterprise VMs, and a persistent kind of endeavor. It's one of those, nudge, nudge, wink, wink things. It's not supported, but you can do it. But it is on the roadmap for this year to be able to support all of the VMs, all the different Windows types you would experience with this solution, including multi-session. So once that becomes something into production, it's really easy to synchronize all those apps into Intune from the Microsoft Store and just deploy out uninstalls for them. And that way, if someone goes back and tries to install it later, you've got some kind of mechanism in place to account for that configuration drift. So there's a couple of different ways you can handle it.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Hey, thank you for your demonstration, and yeah, appreciate it.
Sure, John, no problem.
Okay, any more questions? It's a quiet group.
I'm gonna start. I know some of these people, so if they don't start asking questions, I'm gonna start calling them out.
Right. Yeah. There'll be a short test afterwards, right?
Yeah. The one thing to keep in mind is I know the management of it looks kind of difficult. It's by no means like any Microsoft product, set it and forget it. But a lot of times, once you get it working, it does just work pretty well. And the PowerShell commands, once you work in it a lot, it's not bad. And again, there is a GUI that's coming soon that'll make management of it a little bit easier. So just don't let that deter you, right? a pretty easy to stand up solution if you have an immediate need for your work from home users. And there are other third-party tools if you want to GUI immediately. Nerdio has one. I believe that actually there's a Horizon, a Workspace ONE Horizon add-on that kind of sits on top of Virtual Desktop that will manage it for you if you're really heavy into VMware or VMware Shop or Workspace ONE in general. So that could be an option for you. Just keep in mind there are added costs, licensing costs, those types of solutions. So there's many different ways you can deploy it.
I just have one comment, and that's that if you've ever tried to set up remote desktop or the old Microsoft remote app, this is worlds easier. It may not seem like it, but it's worlds easier than that.
It's the next evolution of RDS, right? They're trying to get RDS to compete with the Citrix of the world without all the extra licensing costs that comes along with something like that. So, and they've done a pretty good job.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap it up for today. Thanks everyone for attending, and don't forget to tell your less experienced members of your teams that we're going to do an introductory presentation next month. We'll teach them the whole Azure platform in an hour and a half, which is probably impossible, but we'll give it a shot anyway. Okay, thanks for attending, and we'll see you then.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bill. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jerry.